Hey guys, my name is Tensor. Welcome to another Flutter tutorial video. In today's video, we're going to try to finish this weather application project that we've been working on. And because we're using observables and our RX commands, we're going to bring in the RX widget plugin. The RX widget plugin is a plugin that gives us access to a bunch of widgets that work really well with reactive streams, observables, and commands. Before we get into that though, there are a few minor things that I would like to mention. Inside of our response.dart, there was a minor mistake. I had written longitude as LONG rather than LON. So I've corrected this problem and I've built out a new response. Also, there were a few ints that were supposed to be doubles, and I should have caught this earlier, but for whatever reason I didn't. If you want to see all of the changes, make sure to take a look at the final GitHub repository when I post it. Also, inside of our model, we've made a few changes here. One of the major changes is for the temperature field. You can see here that we're actually doing some computation, and this is because OpenWeatherMaps API gives us the temperature in Kelvin. So we need to convert it from Kelvin to Fahrenheit because that's what we want to display. I know that many of you are not from the United States, so you probably prefer that the temperature be in Celsius. If you want to get Celsius, all you have to do is subtract 273.15 from the temperature that you're getting from the API. Whereas because we want to get Fahrenheit, we have to multiply this by 9/5 and then subtract 459.67. One final thing to mention is that I've trimmed out the wind field because I don't really feel like that would be an important field to implement, at least right now. And I've added in the icon field. If we pull up a response inside of the weather list that we get back from the API, there is this icon field. And if we connect this icon field to a certain URL, it will allow us to gain access to a picture which we can very easily serve into our application. Each of these icons corresponds with the weather in the current area. And these little icons are things like a sun for a clear sky, and if it's nighttime it'll show a moon, things like that. So it's pretty cool. Originally I was going to implement this type of feature using a special font, and I'll have to save that for another tutorial. So inside of our model we have the icon now, it's a string, and then down in the constructor it's just response weather at the 0 indexed, and then we're grabbing the icon field. Alright, so now with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our current user interface. We just have our main function, then we have our root widget, and then we have a stateful widget that builds out an MP scaffold. There are quite a few imports that we want to make for our user interface. We need to bring in our weather repo, our model command, our model, and our model provider. And we also need to bring in the HTTP package, and I'll alias this as HTTP. We do also want to bring in the RX widgets library. The current version for this is 1.0.2, so it's just RX_widgets, and then you just put in the current version. And this is the version that I will be using for this tutorial. We can now come back into our main.dart file and bring in RX widgets by typing in package rxwidgets /rxwidgets.dart. Alright, so now let's implement our model provider, and we want to put this at the base of our application. So one way to do this would be to actually put it inside of the run app and around the my app widget. So you could do something like this: run app, model provider, child, and then put in my app. And then to actually input the model command, we can come up here and instantiate our weather repo by putting in an instance of the HTTP client. And then we can instantiate our model command and then input our repo into it. And now directly inside of our model provider, we can pass in our repository. And this will now wrap our entire application with this inherited widget and give all of our widgets access to the model command through the use of our of method. Now let's come down into our stateful widget and we'll build out the app bar. We want our app bar to have various actions, and we're doing this mainly so that we can implement a button that will allow us to execute our get GPS command. as well as implement a little menu so that the user can select how many cities they want to bring in from the application. The first widget that we want to put into our actions will be a container with a center, and then from our Rx widget library we can bring in a Rx loader. The way the Rx loader works is when we do not have a value from our observable that we connect to this Rx loader, we'll see a little spinner object, so just like a little half circle that spins around. And we can of course increase and decrease the radius of this spinner object through this property here, which is called radius, so you put in a double. And then we have the command results property, which is the actual command that we want to connect this Rx loader to. I'm going to connect this to our get GPS command by calling model provider of, passing in the context, and then passing in get GPS command. And then we have a data builder, which takes in the build context, and then the data that's being passed from our get GPS command's observable, which in this case is a Boolean. And here I can then just build up another widget, in this case, which is just a text field, which will have our data as a string. So this will just show either true or false based on whether or not our device can access the GPS. If you remember, our getGPS function just calls this isLocationOperational function, and then it prints out true if it's successful and false if it is not. Also, our getGPS command is important because it allows us to conditionally shut down the update location command. If we want our text field to actually look a little bit better than just a true or false value, we can take and use a ternary operator, and we can say, okay, well, if the data comes back as true, then we want to put out a string that says the GPS is active. Otherwise, we can put out a string that says GPS is inactive. And this is a little bit more professional than just printing out true or false. Inside of our Rx loader, we also want to specify a placeholder builder and an error builder. The placeholder builder builds out if there is no data coming in from the observable, and then the error builder builds out if we get an error back from the observable. So with our placeholder builder, we're just going to put out a text field that just says push the button, and then with our error builder, we're going to just print out the exception to the screen. Now, next to this Rx loader, we can create an icon button. This icon button will have an icon of GPS fixed, and this will just be a little GPS icon that has like a filled-in circle. And then the onPressed event will call our getGPS command directly. And this will be a button that will then check to see if the device can access the GPS location data. So that's all we really want to do for our app bar for now. So now let's go down into our body. First, before we do that, let's make sure that we have this resize to avoid bottom padding set to false inside of the scaffold. And then the body for this scaffold will be a column. Inside of our column, we want to essentially have a list view for all of the weather information. And then below it, we want to have a button that will allow the user to click and get the weather information. And then we also want to have a slider next to that button which will allow the user to cut off the data usage for this application. So inside of our column we can create an expanded, and then the child for this expanded will be another Rx loader. This time we'll put in our list of weather model, and then the load circle will have a radius of 30. Our command result will point towards our update weather command, and then we'll have our data builder, our placeholder builder, and our error builder. Inside of our data builder, we'll just put in a container. For our placeholder builder, we'll give it a center, and then inside of it we'll have a text field that just says no data. And then for our error builder, we'll put in a center with a text field that has our exception in it. So down here we can create a stateless widget, and we'll call this weather list. This will be the list view that we can put into our data builder. We can initialize our list of weather model by saying final list of weather model list and then passing it into our weather list constructor. So when we construct this widget, we just pass in our list directly. And then down in our build function, we can return a list view builder function. So now in our list view builder, we'll set up the item count, which is just the list length, and then the item builder, which just takes in the build context and then the int index. And for each index item, we'll return a list tile. For now, just to simplify things, we'll put in for the title field just the text with our list index cities. So this will just be the name of each of the cities. And we're just going to do this so that we can check to see that we're actually getting the data in our application, and then we'll build out the rest of the fields afterwards. So now back up in our RX loader, in the data builder function, we can return a weather list and we can pass in our data directly. So here's what our current weather app looks like inside of our emulator. We have our title, which is just weather app, and then we have this little text that says push the button, and then we have our little icon button, and we can push it, and now the text changes to GPS active because we can currently access our GPS. In here we have our little list view, and it's got all of the names of the 10 different cities that we automatically pull in on initialization. So now down below the expanded, we'll create a container. We'll give it a little padding, and inside of it we'll create a row. And the first element in our row will be a container with a little bit of padding, and we'll have what's called a widget selector inside of this. The widget selector is a widget that allows us to base what widget we want to be built on a Boolean observable. For this example, we're going to base our widget selector on whether or not the update location command observable can execute. And this will send back a true or a false value. So inside of this widget, we can specify an onTrue widget, which means when we get can execute back as true, this widget will show. And this widget will be a material button with a child of text, which just says get the weather. And then on pressed, we'll be able to execute our update location command. On false, however, we'll have a material button with an onPressed of null, and then this will have text of loading. And actually for the first onPressed event, we'll put in update location command .execute to actually call the handler function. For the onTrue material button, we'll give a little bit of elevation, just 5.0, and we'll give it a color of blue-gray. And then for the onFalse, we'll have a 0 elevation, and we'll also give it a color of blue-gray. So here's what the app looks like now. You can see we now have this button at the bottom, and when we click it, you can see for a second it actually does say loading, even though it loads pretty quickly. And now it's actually changed the data that's inside of our view. In this case, we have a bunch of different cities around Paris because that's where our GPS is located. Now below the container that has the widget selector widget, we can create another container. We'll give it a little padding so that we push it over to the right, and this will just be padding on the left. And then what we'll do is we'll have a column here, and the column will have some text, and then it will have our slider. For our slider, we'll create a new stateful widget, and this stateful widget will have two fields, a slider state and a command. The slider state will be a Boolean, and the command will be a value changed function with a Boolean inside of it. The value changed function is just basically a callback type inside of Flutter that allows us to basically tell the framework that a value has changed. So then in the widget constructor, we put in the slider state and the command, and then we have our slider state object, and this will also have the two fields. And in its constructor, we'll also pass those two fields in. That way we can just pass them directly in when we call the create state function. And actually I made a mistake. I didn't mean to make these two fields final. Down in the build function, we just return a switch element. And the value for the switch element by default will be our slider state. And then the onChanged will take in the Boolean value and then call setState and change the slider state. And then afterwards it will call to the command handler that we're passing into it. So now we can create our slider item by coming back up into our main widget. And in here, we just create the slider item. We put in the slider state. By default, it will be true, so it'll be on by default. And then our command that we want to link it to will be the radio checked command, which, if you remember, this is the command that's directly connected to our update weather command, which calls to the API. So when this is switched off, we should not be able to update the items inside of our application. And now what we can do is we can put a container below it. We'll give it a little bit of padding, and then we'll give it a child which will say turn off data to indicate that by clicking this slider you turn off all data from this application and you can't update the weather list. So here's what our application looks like now. So if we click this slider and now we click get weather, you'll see that this does not update at all. However, if we do turn on the slider and then update, you'll see that it now does update. Alright, so now we have most of the features for this application implemented. We just really need to add one more feature and then a few more fields so that we can see a little bit more of the data. Recall that inside of our weather repo we have this add cities function. We can create a command out of this function, and then we can use that command so that we can change the city count that we pull in from the API. So here inside of our model command file, I'll create a new command. I'll call this add cities command, and we'll be using the create sync one method for this because it's a synchronous function and because the function takes in a value but doesn't output a value. So here we're taking in an integer and we're not outputting anything, so we can just annotate this with int. And then inside of it we pass in repo.addCities. And now we want to add it both to the top here and to the bottom constructor here. So up here we can create a new Rx command field called add cities command, and we can now put this in our main constructor like this. And then down at the bottom we can add our add cities command with the underscore in. So to implement this feature, we want to specify the various different numbers that we want to be able to pass into this function. So at the bottom of our file, I'll create a final list of integers called menu numbers, and inside of it, we'll increment our numbers from 5 all the way up to 50. And then we can use this list to generate a pop-up menu, which will allow the user to select one of these numbers, which will then let them indicate how many items they'd like to get from our API. Inside of our app bar actions and below our icon button, we can create a pop-up menu button with an integer inside of it as a new widget. And for this pop-up menu button, we can put in some padding, we can put in a tooltip, and then we can have an onSelected function which will execute when the user selects an item inside of this menu. Each item is an integer, and we'll pass that integer into our add cities command. And then we have an item builder, which is the function that lets us generate this list. So inside of our item builder function, we can just return menu numbers mapped onto a pop-up menu item. And for the pop-up menu item, we just need to specify the value that it stands for. So this is the value that gets passed into the onSelected when it's selected, and then the actual widget that will represent that value. In this case, we'll just have a center, and then we'll have a child with a text inside of it, which is just our number as a string. And then we need to, of course, turn this into a list. So now inside of our application, we have these 3 dots, and I can click on them. This opens up our menu. You can see we have all of our items in here. I can select how many items we want to bring back from our API, so I'll select 5. And then when I click Get the Weather, this will only bring back 5 items. Alright, so now that we have all of the features implemented, let's actually build out our list view, or rather our list tile, so that it has all of the information that we want to display. So let's start with our leading item. The leading item will be a widget which calls to the network, and the network will call to this openweathermap.org image w. We'll take the icon as a string, put it into this string here, and then add .png to the end of it. And this will bring up a image representation of the icon that we get through our API. Then with the title, we'll have a container with some padding, and we'll have our city. And of course this will be as a string. Then for the subtitle, so below the city, we'll have our temperature, and we want this to be a string representation of the temperature, and we'll have it as a fixed string, so it'll only have 2 decimal places at most. Then our trailing widget will be a container with a column, and then inside of this column we'll have a text with our description. Below it we'll have a container with some padding at the top, and we'll have a text field with our latitude. We'll give this a little bit of text style, so we'll make it italics and we'll make it a little smaller, so 12.0 is the font size. And then for the second part, we'll have our longitude, so the same thing we did with our latitude, and then the style is exactly the same as the latitude. So here is now what our application looks like. So currently it is night in Paris, and we get all of these different moon icons. We also get the temperature, so it's 58.75 degrees in most of these places. We get the sky, we get the latitude and the longitude of each of the cities here. We also get the names of the cities. If we reload our application, here's the dummy app for the areas around Toronto. You can see the icons are different because there's currently rain in these areas. So now I'm looking at San Diego. You can see we have a bunch of different weather states for San Diego. We can select another GPS location, so let's go to the map. Let's go to Tokyo because it's radically different than all the other places. And you can see it loads, so we get this little circle, which is nice. And here's all these cities around Tokyo. Now, one other thing that we haven't really looked at yet is how this item actually works and how it actually will shut off this button if the GPS isn't active. The way to turn off the GPS in your emulator is to go to Settings, Location, and then in here you just turn off the GPS with this little slider. So now if we come in here and I click this button, it will now say GPS inactive, and this button will turn into a button that says loading ... And if we try to click on it, nothing happens. And that's because now we have no access to the GPS. So if I turn back on the GPS and I click this button, now our button is now active again. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. If you dislike this tutorial, then by all means downvote it as much as you like. Have a good day.